evening, kiddies. It is I, your host, the Mad Catter, here with another episode of Twisted Teatime. Tonight's tea is a Cabernet Sauvignon from a particularly cheap label. What can I say? My host body is a bit on the poor side, but it's palatable all the same. Our episode promises to be very special. It's going to focus around a topic that is of interest to a number of people out there, either because they have a morbid fascination with it or because they want to pursue it. Meow, have you ever felt alone? Like you didn't belong? Like life would be better if you found people who understood and accepted you for you? Provided, of course, you followed a strict set of rules, guidelines, and protocols, and did whatever you were told. Probably not. But there are many out there who are so hungry for this sort of sense of belonging that they'll fall into the welcoming arms of a cult. Now, cults have been an insidious presence in both the imaginations and societies of the world, whether made-up threats of Satanism tied to harmless games as indicated by, or as evidenced, rather, by the great panic surrounding Dungeons & Dragons in the 80s, or something very real and sinister, such as the Manson family or Jonestown. Cults have been and are sources of fascination for many and obsession for others. Well, today's tale delves into the old fears of child-snatching cults, as a father writes to his uncle about the truth behind the time his daughter went missing. I present to you Confession by Z.P. Gowdy.
Dear Reverend C. Renhard, I know we haven't been terribly close since I left the family trade and moved to Sauvie Island with Ellen and Emily, but writing you seems appropriate somehow. Perhaps being my uncle and a reverend, even a retired reverend, has something to do with that. As you are aware, October of 1936 was a dark year for my little family. But you do not know how truly terrible those events were. Which is why I am writing you, Uncle, to free myself of a burden that has weighed upon me these many years. I fear sharing with the Lord through prayer has provided little respite, and I feel sharing my story with a more mortal recipient will better ease the weight from my shoulders. Looking back, I see the signs as plain as day. I think we all did after a fashion. We saw ourselves as reasonable and godly folk, not the overly superstitious Puritans of this nation's past. Swedish blood is practical blood, after all. Still, the signs were there and were promptly ignored. Milk spoiling overnight on one farm, a mutilated cow on another, babes refusing to stop crying, and the nightmares. Individually, I suppose it could have been chalked up to bad food, ill luck, or even God's mysterious will, but there was nothing godly about those events. Emily was only 7 when she went missing. Old enough to play in the yard by herself, smart enough not to go wandering off, but still innocent, still far too trusting. And why shouldn't she be? This is an island. We are as close as a community can be. Everyone quite simply knows everyone else, though perhaps that sense of security and trust is partially to blame for those events. I suppose I should get to the point instead of beating around the bush, as it were. She was playing in front of the house as I made my way out into the field. She was as safe as any parent imagines their child to be when in their own yard and within sight of their own home. I returned shortly after, having forgotten something inside, when I noticed she was gone. Still, I wasn't concerned. After all, she might have merely gone around back or ducked out of sight for a bit. Upon returning, I might have gone back into the field like a fool, had not something caught my eye. A sense of dread weighed down on me in the pit of my stomach. I hadn't heard a scream, and there were no signs of a struggle. She was just gone without a trace, save for the candy wrappers. They were scattered about on the ground where she had been playing. We had no candy in the house. It was a luxury we had little time or money for. If Emily and Thomas received sweets, it was in the form of cookies and other treats that might be baked in an oven. But like all children, she loved candy when she could get her hands on it. The lack of it on the island meant it was that much more precious of a commodity to a child, and immediately I saw a dark scenario playing out in my mind. It was then that I started calling for Emily. Cautiously at first. It wouldn't do to panic, only to find her behind a bush munching on sweets she had received from a friend or neighbor. She didn't answer, however, and soon my calls became louder and more urgent. Ellen emerged from the house. She ever did have more sense than I, and upon seeing my concerned demeanor, she deduced that our daughter was missing and made her way to our employer, Mr. Howell's home. She returned shortly with some of the other farmhands, and by evening the entire community was searching for her. We never found her, though. She was but the first. As October stretched on, other children disappeared, each one gone without a trace save for empty candy wrappers. We searched every time, but to no avail. A town meeting was called, and we received help from the law in Portland, for all the good that did, as it quickly became evident that we weren't going to find Emily or any of the other missing children. We tried to keep it from happening. We locked our doors at night, forbade the little ones from playing outside without someone watching them, and we made sure they knew that candy was forbidden. I was hit rather hard by all of this. Emily was the light of my life, and in a mere instant, with me not 50 yards away, she was gone, and I was none the wiser until it was far too late. I am supposed to be the provider, the protector of my family. I am supposed to be vigilant and watchful, and I failed in my duties as a father. Or at least that was how I felt at the time. Rest assured, Ellen and the others in the community did their best to convince me and other fathers like me that it wasn't the case. It was no use. I fell into the bottle. Hard. Ellen had the patience of Job through all this. She was my rock, and while I knew she hated my drinking, she did everything she could to help me cope, even if it meant leaving me to my own devices. I was never in the house while I drank. I'd often go out into the fields if I had been kicked out of the local bar or just wanted to be alone with my booze. The last thing I needed was to have a moment of anger come over me and find myself striking either my wife or my son. One evening, mere days before All Hallows' Eve, as the sun sank towards the horizon, my mind was overtaken by a very bad idea. I went into the house and took up my shotgun and lantern, all as Ellen looked on warily. Then I went outside towards a portion of the woods that I swore hadn't been properly searched. I was going to find those missing children myself, and I was successful, after a fashion. Sauvie Island is not a large island by any means, nor does it have a great number of people living on it in the best of times. And even with help from Portland, we had found nothing. Still, some insistent voice in my subconscious was certain one part of the island hadn't been searched as thoroughly as we would have liked to believe. As I wandered those woods, dark despite the sun still hanging above the horizon, I knew how 10 or 20 people might miss a crucial detail. There must have been some level of sense in my head, for I remembered to mark the trail as you had taught me. Time became hard to track in there. Not only was my head swimming with spirits, but there was a persistent darkness that ensured the use of my lantern not long after I began to walk amongst the trees. I would pause as my ears strained to help assist my poor vision. I caught every cracking twig, every insect chirp or rustle of the underbrush, and my inebriated imagination fashioned each sound into its own boogeyman or child killer. My greatest fear in that moment was not that something would strike me down, but that it would do so before I had a chance to bring my gun to bear on it and get at least that much vengeance. Then I started seeing the dolls. Children's dolls, and worse, dolls made out of twigs, branches, and animal bones. They hung from the trees or were nailed to them like some sort of twisted Halloween decoration. There were enough of them that surely one of the search parties should have seen them at some point, unless they were placed there recently. At one point I stumbled over a tree root, and it was by chance or the grace of God Almighty that in falling I didn't shatter or douse my lantern, though it did crack my head something awful. Something about the motion of the fall combined with the pain made me throw up. Not the most dignified act, but it probably helped keep my head from being further hampered by the day's earlier drink. When I looked up after emptying my stomach, I beheld something carved into the tree's trunk. It had to have been made within the last day or so. It was some sort of rune, kind of like the ones Papa showed me as a boy, the old runes of our people. I didn't recognize it, though. It felt dark, horrid, like some sort of blight that would even turn the faces of heathen pagans sour. It was a simple thing, a crude triangle that didn't quite fit perfectly within a circle. I pressed on. Soon I began to smell something that seemed absolutely out of place in those dark woods. Cooking meat. Somewhat sweet, like roasting ham, but different. As far as I knew, there were no hermits living in these woods, and unless I had gotten so turned around that I was near another farmhouse, no one should have been preparing any sort of food requiring a fire. My stomach had mixed emotions regarding the scent. I was hungry now, especially after depositing the contents of my earlier meal onto the forced floor, and the smell of cooking meat was savory. Maybe it was the memory of throwing up or that strange quality to the smell that made me think it wasn't in fact roasting ham, but the conflict of hunger and revulsion soon had my stomach churning. Dry heaving wasn't much better than throwing up. It reminded me of drowning somehow, that gasping for air that wouldn't quite come as your empty stomach tried to rid itself of contents it no longer held. I tried to move forward from my crouched position, and once more I stumbled. I managed to catch myself before falling, but this time I dropped the lantern, and it went out. Immediately I snatched it up and began inspecting it for damage, and that was when I noticed multiple things at once. First, I could see the moon was out and the woods had thinned. With sight, I was able to discern that the lantern was fine. I also noticed that there were candy wrappers scattered about. Not many, but they were lying about the forest floor before me as though dropped while the owner consumed their contents before opening another. Lastly, I could see a cabin, or hut, not too far away from which shone a light and issued smoke, as well as a particular aroma I had been both hungering for and sickened by. I heard something in the distance, a faint call of my name, but there was a breeze just then, and it could have easily have been the wind in the trees. Still, I was grateful the lantern had gone out. I only hoped I could light it quickly if necessary, but for that moment, if my drunken stumbling hadn't alerted anyone of my presence, it was best I didn't do anything further that might give it away. Creeping up to the house, I placed myself under one of the windows, away from the door. If I was noticed, I wanted to make sure it took whoever was inside as long as possible to exit the house and get to me, either giving me enough time to ready my gun or to run, depending on what spirit took me when confrontation occurred. I mustered my courage, wishing I hadn't forgotten my drink back at the house, for I could have used some of that bolstering liquid at that moment when I peeked into that window. The cabin could have been any old hunting cabin one might find in the Oregon wilderness, or at least at first glance. For that was when I started to notice the details, and we all know where the devil lies. There were numerous dried herbs hanging or resting on the shelves, more than I knew existed for cooking locally. There were also more of those fetishes, those strange dolls made from branches or animal bones. Then there were those blasphemous runes, carved into the beams in a darkly beautiful manner, hanging from the walls or above the mantel of the fireplace like one might hang a cross or a crucifix. The fireplace pushed all thoughts of those heretical designs from my mind. It was far too large for a cabin that size, as wide as a grown man is tall, and above the crackling flames roasted the evening's meal. The horror of realization dawned upon me. That thing spitted above the flames was shaped differently than most of the pigs on the island, and while the limbs had apparently been hacked off, it was clear even to my drunken mind that it belonged to a human. A particularly young human. Movement tore my attention away from the macabre sight, and I almost let out a yell that would have surely given my position away, for I saw a figure, apparently having been sitting just out of sight of the window, move to the fireplace to turn the spit. I ducked the instant I registered what I saw. It was a monstrous form, large and brutish, wearing a tattered, ill-kept cloak that covered it from head to toe, and its face was a horned skull. In hindsight, it was not but a ram's skull mask, but I was not exactly in the proper frame of mind. I needed one last peek, though. One last look through the window before I planned to flee and alert the townsfolk of what I had seen. For surely this was where the children had been taken. I do not know why I felt like I needed to look again. Perhaps I had just wanted to make sure this wasn't some dark vision fueled by alcohol and fear, that my imagination hadn't dressed the side of a hunter's cabin into a place of nightmares. Slowly, I raised my head to gaze through the window once more, only to see the skull, that monstrous abomination, glaring out at me through hate-filled eyes. We both moved at once. I was shocked. My instincts allowed me to move at all, but as horrified as I was, I knew I had to get out of there. The thing under those robes was large, and while I am a laborer and not exactly a violent man by nature, I have been in enough fights in my youth to know that it was better to keep a larger foe at a distance. This knowledge was hammered home that evening, for the last thing I saw before I acted was that thing snatching up a wicked and rusted-looking sickle. I ran. It burst out the door like a demon-possessed bull, charging towards me, his sickle poised to strike. This was not my most graceful moment, nor my bravest, but I slipped on the dead leaves, and with a yelp, I dropped the shotgun. He came at me, and I scrambled away. I was panicked, and my distress was made even worse when I felt my back bump up against a tree. Then it was upon me. It swung the sickle at my head or neck. Somehow I managed to push away and slide under its strike as the blade was buried into the stout trunk of the tree, inches deep. Such was the brute's strength. I rolled, and he kicked out at me, his foot connecting with my hip and sending me tumbling right to my fallen shotgun. I saw its eyes then as I picked up my weapon. It must have been regretting swinging with the blade instead of following through with the charge. In hindsight, had he simply barreled into me bodily, slammed me against that tree, I'd likely have gone missing myself that evening, perhaps even wound up roasting over a fire days later. I leveled the shotgun and fired both barrels at that creature's body. Despite my proximity, despite being almost close enough to extend my arm and press the shotgun to its side, I missed my mark. I had been aiming for the trunk of the thing's body. Instead, I took out its knees. He let out a scream, an all-too-human scream this time, and a chill ran through me as I reloaded my weapon and backed away. I'm surprised I didn't drop the shells. In his pain, he wrenched the sickle from the tree and tried to come at me despite his damaged knees. He was already falling, but his lunge might have taken me had I not staggered away. I aimed for the face that lay behind the ram's head mask, but either his lurch or my inability to fight properly under pressure saw me miss my target again. The barrel dropped too low, and instead of taking him in the head, I took him in the belly. He went silent and still. I could only imagine the shock that adorned his hidden visage. Perhaps I could have finished him off. Perhaps that would have been the wiser thing, but he wasn't going to move anywhere fast, and that stomach wound was fatal. Even if he was someone I wanted to get to a doctor right away, I couldn't have saved him. So instead, I ran. Some distance away, I was in the darkness. The moon broke through the canopy of the woods just enough for me to make out looming shadows that were hopefully trees, allowing me to avoid them. Confident I was not being chased by anyone or anything else, I quickly began setting about lighting the lantern, but I froze before I could get the wick lit. I heard voices. Looking up, I saw a light, another lantern moving through the darkness and heading in my direction. Or perhaps heading the way I had come. So relieved was I to see another person in these woods that I almost called out to them, but my instincts, or perhaps God's own warning, bade me to silence, and instead I hid behind the bushes that hugged the trunk of a nearby tree. More figures, plainly human, at least one woman and one man, the third I couldn't make out as either or. They were speaking in low and urgent tones, and while I could have sworn I recognized their voices, I could not make out their words. I knew I recognized the robes they were wearing, however, even if I couldn't see the masks. They each held a satchel or bag in which such a mask could have been carried or hidden. Regardless, in my mind, these people were with the man I had shot mere moments ago. Whatever conversation they were holding, it was hushed and intense. Likely they had heard the shots earlier. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a hint of fear, concern. Once I thought it was safe, I quickly began to head back in the direction they had come from. I stopped only when their light was out of sight, and even then an additional 10 minutes later, whereupon I took the time to relight the lantern. I was able to find the trail markings again. However far I had fallen, I swear the Lord God was watching out for me. Or at least one of the angels. Better than finding my path, however, I was soon found by people. People not wearing robes or sporting ram skull masks. It was the Erickson brothers, who quickly took me to the rest of their party, led by Mr. Howell and his men. Apparently Ellen, bless her soul, had grown deeply concerned when I didn't return after dark. She quickly got word around about what had happened, and soon a search party had formed. They had been especially concerned when they had heard the gunshots, and their faces grew grim as the grave when I explained what I had seen and what had happened. I think, oddly enough, it was the mention of the candy wrappers that sparked them to action. They didn't want to give these monsters in human form, these witches, time to escape righteous retribution for their actions. Not when we had them cornered. We were filled with the fever of vengeance, a fever we swore was charged with the pure fury of the Holy Spirit, and we made quick time back to that cabin. Some of the men had torches, some had lanterns filled with oil. Tom Erickson and Mr. Howell had their rifles. We weren't a full-on village mob, but we might as well have been. I fear we damned ourselves that night. For while we believed we had God's holy wrath on our side, is not wrath one of the 7 deadly sins? I'm afraid old Nick was setting fire and brimstone to our veins instead of anything pure and righteous. We saw movement from within the hut. There was a commotion from inside as one of those cultists looked out the window and saw us and our anger before them. I swear I saw Mrs. Coulter putting on the ram's head mask. I noticed a trail of bloodied mud and leaves leading up to the cabin. The beast of a man had managed to drag himself back to his unholy sanctuary. We wasted no time. We saw 3 through the windows, 4 if you counted the brute who remained out of sight, and we knew it was time to act. The door to the cabin was the kind that opened outward, so we barricaded it with a stout branch to prevent their escape. Lanterns smashed against the outer walls, oil splashing and catching fire. If it didn't ignite, someone with a torch remedied that quickly. We were mad men possessed, and we let our righteous wrath and anger descend upon these worshippers of Satan. Before the cabin was fully ablaze, we broke open the windows, and those of us with firearms shot at the cultists like fish in a barrel. They screamed and cursed us, cursed our families, cursed our island, swore that they would return to take our precious children whenever we celebrated All Hallows' Eve, swore they would have vengeance for our interference, swore they would complete their dark ritual. We heard it all, and despite shooting them at point-blank range, none were killed instantly. None were spared the slow death of burning alive in that hut. And we weren't spared being subject to their curses. Had that been it, as vicious as it all was, my conscience would be clean. However, it took 3 men to pull me from that house as I cried out in maddened anguish. Let me emphasize, for we are getting to the painful heart of the matter. I cried out in anguish, not in anger, not in wrath. For in the end, they had to tear me from that window, my hands and arms cut with broken glass and burned by flames as I tried to climb into the accursed cabin. For I had been back at the very window I had spied through before. I had seen the man I had shot before, our eyes locked as I planned on finishing him off. The bottom half of his mask was broken away, revealing a beard I swore belonged to Joseph the Trapper. The flames were burning hot now. The others had pulled away, and he lay there on the floor, wounded and dying as his fellow witches screamed their death curses at us. I cared not for their words. Then Joseph smiled. With visible effort, he rolled over to reveal a detail his giant dying frame had concealed, one that I had either not noticed before or had been hidden from me. A trap door, sealed with a padlock. It was at that moment I saw it shudder. It was then that I heard the screams that belonged not to the dying cultists within the cabin. I heard the screams of children. I'm so sorry, Reverend. I'm so sorry, Uncle. May God have pity on my poor, foolish, wretched soul. On all of our souls. When I explained the madness that had come over me, they dismissed me for a man lost in the throes of passion and rage. They agreed to wait, however, and see what was revealed when the fires died down. This is another part of the story no one knows. A part I and others have kept secret. For while the papers published that the cultists were members of our very community, that they had died horrible and just deaths, and that the bodies of the missing children had been found, they failed to mention who had killed them. There was one small mercy, though, one sliver of a saving grace. Other than the poor boy on the spit, all the other children had died of smoke inhalation, their bodies preserved for a proper funeral. It was a comfort, albeit a small one, that I got to hold my Emily one last time. This is my story, Uncle Carl. This is my confession. This is the burden I have been carrying all these years. Had it not been for Ellen and Thomas, I might have ended my life soon after that night. I might have committed the sin of suicide. But I had to stay strong, and I had to carry this burden for their sakes. I am concerned that it's not entirely over yet. For while I was overcome with emotion during their execution, the others had better listened to their curses. Digging through the burnt-out ruins, we found further evidence of their activities in the basement where they had kept the children prisoner. We had interrupted something the night of our attack, something that they had been planning. It was the 29th of October. The 30th would have been the full moon. We don't know what exactly it was they were going to do, but it can't have been anything other than foul. Their curse said that they would take our children when we celebrated All Hallows' Eve, that they would return and complete their unholy rite. We may not have been terribly superstitious, but their words did not seem hollow to our minds. We hoped we found a solution in not celebrating Halloween at all. It seems to have worked thus far. Instead, on October 31st, everyone simply goes inside early that day and sits with their families, has supper, and enjoys their time together. Personally, I think it is better this way. Thank you for reading my confession, Uncle. Even if it doesn't absolve me of my sins that night, I know I shall rest easier knowing that someone else has been made aware of the events that actually occurred. Your loving nephew, Alexander Renhard.
Welcome back, kitties! I do hope you enjoyed that tale. Ah, poor Alexander. You could say that his haste to burn down that little hut, well, it caught his daughter breathless. Ah, yes, it's a terrible joke from a terrible feline. Now, if you want some more cultish delights, perhaps in the comfort of your own home, on the screen of your own TV, while you're holding a cup of hot cocoa, I have a short list of movies I've been quite fond of that cover that topic. We'll start with, The House of the Devil. It is Ty West and A.J. Bowen's tribute to late 70s and early 80s satanic horror films. It was released in 2009, and this film features an amazing performance by Jocelyn Donahue. And while the cult doesn't show up until later in the film, it plays perfectly to the fears surrounding satanic cults of the time. It's a classic babysitting job gone horribly and terribly wrong, and the film's violent finish is quite satisfying. I heartily recommend it. The Wicker Man. And no, before you say anything, not the Nicolas Cage remake. At least not unless you want to play some sort of bad movie drinking game. No, I'm referring to the original 1973 classic by Robin Hardy, which is a far superior tale. Imagine, if you will, a devoutly Christian cop who happens to be incredibly repressed, stuck on an island with a bunch of horny pagans. Mix the two up, and amazingly enough, rather than a hilarious comedy or some sort of bizarre themed porn, you have a horror classic, also highly recommended, featuring 100% less memes about bees. Now, Children of the Corn is another classic, and like many Stephen King adaptations, it has a few ridiculous moments, but John Franklin's enthusiastic portrayal of Isaac alone makes the film worthwhile in my book. The Sacrament is another film by Ty West. It came out in 2013. Now it follows a camera crew as they get inside a cult very similar to Jonestown. Of course, What starts as a documentary takes a particularly dark turn, to say the least, and the crew realizes that they are not safe at all. Gene Jones offers up an amazingly chilling performance as Father, the head of the cults. The Last Shift is a 2014 film directed by Anthony DiBlasi. It takes a slightly different turn from the above films, namely in that the cultists are, well, ghosts. It follows a lone police officer as she takes the last shift at an old police station before it gets shut down. She soon discovers it is haunted by the ghosts of a particularly Manson-esque cult leader, along with two of his followers, committed suicide not long after their arrest. And, of course, what cult movie list or movies about cult list or... How do you say that in a proper fashion? This list would not be complete without including Roman Polanski's 1968 film Rosemary's Baby, an adaptation of the novel by Ira Levin. It has it all. A building with a bad history, a young couple filled with hope for the future, a mysterious pregnancy, and, of course, a cult. Even better is that Polanski consulted with Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, to make sure his film was particularly accurate. Now, as a sort of bonus to this list, slightly less sinister story, but do you remember Jack Chick? Well, he created the infamous Chick Tracts, little comics that proselytized to the masses about the evils of rock and roll, masturbation, and, of course, Dungeons and Dragons. Well, he passed away recently, as I hear, so, with that in mind, I would recommend the movie Dark Dungeons, based on his tract of the same name. This movie was made by Zombie Orpheus Entertainment and handles one of the iconic elements of the Great Panic that had people believing D&D was tied to satanic cults. So this is a little more of a light-hearted way to cap off this list. Alas, my friends, the time has come. It does appear that our story is done. I am afraid that I must fly, but do come back, and please don't die. Twisted Teatime is executively produced for RenagadeRadio.com by Charlie Renagade. You can listen to Twisted Teatime on RenagadeRadio.com Saturday nights at 8 p.m. Opening music for Twisted Teatime and all incidental music is used courtesy of Kevin MacLeod and Incompetech.com. Details can be found in the show notes on SoundCloud.com/Cheshire Hats, where you can find past episodes and side projects. If you want more of me and my mischief, you can find my charming grin on Facebook.com/Cheshire Hat or on Twitter @RealMadCatter. Good night, kitties. Pleasant dreams.